seconds make up a significant portion of the reading and writing section of the new digital SAT. So if you want to perform well in the test, you're going to need to be able to answer them.
Mr. Greenberg! Mr. Greenberg!
What is it, student me?
What if I suck at grammar?
Well, student me, I have good news and I have bad news. The bad news is that English grammar is very complex, and to master it would require years of study. But the good news is that the SAT only tests you on a limited pool of grammar concepts, and within that small pool, some topics come up far more often than others. I've pored over every practice test released by the College Board, and I've come up with the 5 topics that I think are the most important ones to know on test day. And that's what we're going to cover in this video, so stay tuned. So the first concept you'll need to know is how to distinguish between a sentence and a fragment. A sentence is a complete idea that can stand on its own, and a fragment, well, it isn't. And why can't a fragment stand on its own? For starters, every complete sentence needs to have at least one independent clause. An independent clause is going to have a subject, it's going to have a fully conjugated verb. Additionally, it can't begin with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun.
Mr. Greenberg, I told you, I suck at grammar. I have no idea what any of that means.
A subordinating conjunction is a word like because, while, or although. And a relative pronoun is a word like which or that. But don't worry if you don't fully understand. The good news is that in most cases, your ears will be able to distinguish between a sentence and a fragment. A fragment will just sound incomplete. Let's take a look at an example to see how this works. Now, for this kind of question, all that matters is the sentence with the blank in it, so we can safely ignore the first part of the text and focus on the second half. Some historians blank that this tulip mania was the first historical instance of an asset bubble, which occurs when investors drive prices to highs not supported by actual demand. Now, if we analyze this sentence, you can see that the second part begins with which, a relative pronoun, which means it's not going to be an independent clause. But since every complete sentence needs at least one independent clause, that means that the thing before the which must be an independent clause. And as we said before, every independent clause needs both a subject and a conjugated verb. Now we have a subject. The subject is historians, and we need to supply the fully conjugated verb. Now remember that a conjugated verb can't just be an ing or an infinitive, it actually needs to be put into a particular tense. And the only answer that does this is B, claim. Some historians claim that this tulip mania was the first historical instance of an asset bubble. Let's check out another example. Again, in this kind of question, all that matters is the sentence with the blank in it, which in this case is the first sentence. Let's take a look. To survive when water is scarce, embryos inside African turquoise killifish eggs blank a dormant state known as diapause. Now, the first part of the sentence, to survive when water is scarce, that's not a clause. It doesn't have a subject or a verb, so we can ignore it for now, and we know that our independent clause must come in what comes after. Now again, we have a subject, embryos inside African turquoise killifish eggs. And we need to supply a fully conjugated verb. Now looking at our list, this becomes a pretty easy question. There's only one verb that's actually put into a real verb tense, and that is A, enter. African turquoise killifish eggs enter a dormant state known as diapause. Now that we've learned to distinguish between a sentence and a fragment, we're ready for the next concept, run-on sentences and comma splices. Now remember I said that every complete sentence needs at least one independent clause? Well, it can also have more than one independent clause. And when a sentence has more than one independent clause, it's important that those clauses are joined together correctly. Two independent clauses thrown together without any punctuation is called a run-on sentence, while two independent clauses thrown together with just a comma separating them is known as a comma splice. And both of these are common errors on the SAT.
Mr. Greenberg!
What is it, student me?
Then what is the correct way to separate two independent clauses?
Well, I was just getting to that. Actually, there are a lot of ways you can separate independent clauses, but the three most common ones are this: a period, or a semicolon, or a coordinating conjunction. If you don't remember what a coordinating conjunction is, just remember the acronym FANBOYS. It stands for for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. And remember that if you are joining two independent clauses together with the FANBOYS, you're also going to need to have a comma before it. Let's check out an example together. Now, the key for this kind of question is to break the sentence down into its parts, otherwise you're not going to spot the error. First, I'd like to read up until the word out. The Alvarez theory, developed in 1980 by physicist Louis Walter Alvarez and his son Walter Alvarez, maintained that the secondary effects of an asteroid impact caused many dinosaurs and other animals to die out. Now that is a complete sentence. Meanwhile, let's take a look at the thing that comes after. It left unexplored the question of whether unrelated volcanic activity might have also contributed to the mass extinctions. That's a complete sentence too. Now, as I said before, we can't just put them together with no punctuation. That would be a run-on sentence, which means we can rule out answer C. And we also can't put them together with just a comma. That would be a comma splice, so we can rule out answer D. Now, I also said that a coordinating conjunction is a common way to join together two independent clauses, and I mentioned that when you're doing this, you need to have a comma before the conjunction, which means that B is our correct answer. Let's take a look at another example. Again, to spot the error, it helps to break the sentence down into pieces. Let's take a look at the first half. The first computerized spreadsheet, Dan Bricklin's VisiCalc, improved financial record keeping not only by providing users with an easy means of adjusting data in spreadsheets, but also by automatically updating all calculations that were dependent on these adjustments. Now, up until this point, again, we have a complete sentence. And if we look at the second half, we'll find that we have one here too. Prior to VisiCalc's release, changing a paper spreadsheet often required redoing the entire sheet by hand, a process that could take days. Now, I said before that there were three common ways to join together independent clauses: a period, a semicolon, or a comma followed by one of the FANBOYS. And in this case, we only have one of those options: C, a period. Now let's move on to our third essential concept, subject-verb agreement. This one's really simple in theory. A singular subject needs a singular verb, and a plural subject needs a plural verb. But on the SAT, they can make it a little bit more challenging by giving you long sentences that might confuse you. Let's take a look at an example together. Now, in this case, all that really matters is the part that comes after the semicolon in the final sentence. So let's take a look at that. Landing on one of the good spaces, blank a player to skip ahead and arrive closer to the end goal. Now, the blank is asking us to insert a verb, and the first thing that we need to do is to find the subject of the verb. Although the word spaces appears right before the blank, that's not actually the subject. It isn't the spaces that allow a player to skip ahead, it's landing on one of the good spaces. And landing on one of the good spaces is a phrase. It's singular, which means we're going to need to have a singular verb. Now, looking at our answer choices, there's one answer and only one answer that gives us a singular verb. The answer is A, allow. Landing on one of the good spaces allows a player to skip ahead. Let's take a look at one more example, just for practice. The award-winning book is Harris's first novel, but her writing blank honored before. Now again, looking at the answer choices, I can see that it's asking me to supply a verb, and so the first thing that we should do is find the subject of the verb.
Mr. Greenberg, Mr. Greenberg.
What is it, student me?
I'm a little unclear on the difference between were and have been. I mean, don't they both relate to the past in some way?
Well, student me, the truth is that it doesn't matter, because the subject of the verb is her writing, and writing is singular. And if we look at our answer choices, there's only one option that's singular. C. Has been. Her writing has been honored before. You see how simple that is? I should note that it is possible that the SAT will test you on verb tense. However, in roughly 4 out of 5 cases, you don't need to consider verb tense at all. Simply looking at the subject and making sure that the subject and the verb agree in number is going to be enough to get the correct answer. So before you waste any time considering verb tense, make sure to identify the subject of the verb that you are creating. Now let's move on to the fourth essential concept, pronoun agreement. A pronoun is a word that stands for a noun, and a pronoun always needs to match that noun in number. It also needs to be consistent with other pronouns that have been used in the same sentence or in previous sentences. Let's take a look at an example together. Now in this case, all that really matters is what comes after the colon in the final sentence. So let's focus on that. For example, Japan achieved a 40% reduction in plastic bag use after cashiers were instructed to ask customers whether blank wanted a bag. Now the answer choices give us 4 possible pronouns, and we need to select the correct one. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, who does this pronoun refer to? Well, who wanted a bag? They're probably asking the customers, whether the customers wanted a bag. And customers is plural. Now looking at this, there's only one plural option here, A, they. So that's the correct answer. The cashiers were instructed to ask customers whether they wanted a bag. Let's move on to another example. Now in this case, the second sentence begins with a blank. Blank findings were based on a famous X-ray image of DNA fibers. Now the question we need to ask ourselves is, whose findings are we talking about? Now looking at the first part of the sentence, it's pretty clear that we're talking about the findings of Watson and Crick. And Watson and Crick are 2 people. So what we're going to need is the plural third person possessive pronoun, their. And keep in mind that we never use an apostrophe for possessive pronouns. They apostrophe re is short for they are, and it apostrophe s is short for it is. If you want to use the possessive pronouns, no apostrophes. That means the answer to our question is going to be C. So let's move on to our final essential concept, dangling modifiers. A modifier is an informal term for a phrase that provides additional information about something else in a sentence. And the key thing to remember about modifiers is that they always need to be next to the thing that they're modifying. Now the way that this is usually tested on the SAT is like this. You're going to get a phrase followed by a comma and then a blank. And what you need to know is that the thing that comes after the comma in the blank must be whatever that modifying phrase is describing. Let's take a look at an example together so you can see how this works. Now in this case, all that matters is the beginning of the second sentence, so let's start with that. Upon recovering 2 years later. Again, we see that there's a phrase followed by a comma and then a blank. So the question that we need to be asking ourselves is, who or what recovered 2 years later? Now there's only one logical possibility for that, Henry, which means that we need an answer that puts Henry, and not Henry's reign or his reign, at the beginning of that blank. That means that the correct answer is going to be A. Upon recovering 2 years later, Henry resumed his reign. Let's take a look at another example. Once again, we have a modifying phrase followed by a comma and then a blank. So let's read the modifying phrase together and think about who or what it describes. Despite being cheap, versatile, and easy to produce. Now, who or what in this sentence could be cheap, versatile, and easy to produce? The obvious answer here is commercial plastics, which means we need an answer that puts the commercial plastics at the beginning of that blank. And the only answer that does that is D. Commercial plastics have 2 associated problems. So now we've made it through the 5 most important grammar concepts tested on the SAT. Although there are some other grammar concepts that you will need to know for the test, these 5 concepts alone should allow you to answer more than half of questions correctly. I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I also want to let you know that I've recently created an Instagram account where I will be posting 1 new practice question every week, so make sure to follow me there for additional practice. Thanks for watching, and good luck on the test.